The first thing I smelled wasn't the expensive Arabica beans I usually insisted on every morning. It was copper, a sharp, metallic tang that coated the back of my throat like a layer of old coins. My name is Xavier Sterling, and for 15 years I had built Sterling Global from a two-man operation in a garage into the titan of renewable energy it is today. I was at the peak of my health, a marathon runner with a heart of iron, or so I thought. That Tuesday morning, as I sat in my sun-drenched breakfast nook, my wife Vivian handed me my favorite ceramic mug with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I took a sip, noted the bitter aftertaste, and attributed it to a new batch of beans. Within 10 minutes, the room began to tilt. Within 20, my lungs felt like they were filled with wet cement. As I collapsed onto the Persian rug, the last thing I saw wasn't Vivian calling for an ambulance. It was her standing over me, calmly checking her watch and whispering into her phone, "It's done. Tell the board he's had a massive cardiac event." I didn't die, but for 3 months, I was a prisoner in a private medical facility that felt more like a dungeon. Vivian had told the world I was in a vegetative state, a tragic shell of the man I used to be. She had produced a medical directive forged by a doctor on our payroll that gave her total control over my medical decisions and, more importantly, my voting shares in Sterling Global. While I was being kept in a chemical fog, Vivian was at the office sitting in my chair draped in diamonds that were bought with the blood of my company. She hadn't just taken my seat, she had invited her entire parasitic family into the building. Her brother, Mick, a man who couldn't balance a checkbook to save his life, was now the chief operating officer. Her father was the senior consultant. They were stripping the company of its assets, selling off my secret patents to foreign competitors for pennies on the dollar, all while I was being fed through a tube 10 miles away. The betrayal was total. It wasn't just greed, it was an execution. Vivian had spent years playing the doting wife, the perfect partner who stood by my side at every gala and board meeting. I had trusted her with my life, my secrets, and my legacy. And she had used that trust to measure the exact amount of toxin needed to paralyze my body without stopping my heart. Yet, she wanted me alive just long enough to finalize the transition of power. But she made one mistake. She hired a night nurse named Cassie, a woman whose younger brother I had helped through a pro bono legal clinic years ago. Cassie recognized me. She saw the way my eyes moved when Vivian entered the room. She realized I wasn't a vegetable, I was a man screaming in a silent room. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments and hit that subscribe button, because the way I woke up and dismantled Vivian's entire world is a lesson in why you should never poison a man who knows how to fight from the shadows. For 8 weeks, Cassie systematically reduced the dosage of the sedatives Vivian had ordered. She did it slowly, so the monitors wouldn't show a spike in brain activity that would alert the corrupt doctors. I felt my mind returning like a cold tide. I began to remember the details, the metallic taste of the coffee, the way Vivian had adjusted her hair in the mirror while I lay gasping on the floor. The rage was my only fuel. I spent my nights doing mental exercises, visualizing the blueprints of my building, the codes to my private servers, and the faces of the people I was going to destroy. By the time I was strong enough to squeeze Cassie's hand, I had a plan. I didn't want to just wake up. I wanted to stay dead until the moment Vivian felt most secure. I needed her to gather her entire family in one room. I needed the board to be present for the final transition of my shares. I worked with Cassie to smuggle a earner phone into my room. My first call wasn't to the police. They were too slow, and Vivian had friends in high places. My first call was to Gideon, my former head of security, a man who had been fired and blacklisted by Vivian the day after my collapse. "Gideon," I whispered into the phone, my voice a rasping ghost of what it used to be. "The lion is awake, and he's hungry." Gideon didn't ask questions. He didn't hesitate. Within 48 hours, he had a team of loyalists ready. We knew the schedule. Friday morning was the inaugural Sterling-Vance merger meeting. Vivian was planning to sell 60% of the company to a rival firm, a move that would net her and her family $400 million and erase my name from the building forever. She had even invited the press to witness her triumph over the tragedy of her husband's illness. On Thursday night, Cassie helped me vanish. We used a service elevator and a laundry van. By Friday morning, I was sitting in a darkened van across from the Sterling Global headquarters, watching Vivian's limousine pull up. She stepped out wearing a white suit that looked like a shroud, smiling for the cameras. Behind her followed Mick, their father, and 2 cousins she had put on the payroll. They looked like royalty. They didn't know they were walking into a slaughterhouse. I stepped out of the van, leaning on a cane, my face hidden by a hat and a high-collared coat. I walked into the lobby of my own building. The security guards were new, men Vivian had hired to replace Gideon's team. They looked at me with suspicion, but I didn't head for the elevators. I headed for the service tunnels. I knew this building better than the architects. I knew where the heart was. As I reached the executive floor, I could hear the muffled sound of applause from the boardroom. The meeting had started. Vivian was likely giving her tearful speech about how I would have wanted this. I stood in the darkness of the server room, my fingers flying across the keyboard. I didn't just want to stop the meeting, I wanted to broadcast the poison. I hit the execute button. Every screen in the boardroom and every news feed currently live streaming the event suddenly flickered. The merger presentation disappeared. In its place was a high-definition video from my home security system, a camera Vivian didn't know existed, hidden in the smoke detector of the breakfast nook. The video showed Vivian, calm and focused, stirring a white powder into my ceramic mug. It showed her watching me collapse, and most importantly, it showed her picking up my phone and saying, "He's down, start the liquidation. We have 3 months before the doctors get suspicious." I walked toward the boardroom doors. The shouting inside had already begun. The silence that followed the video broadcast was so heavy it felt like the building itself was bracing for an earthquake. I stood outside the double mahogany doors of the boardroom, my hand resting on the cool brass handle. Inside, the roar of 100 voices, investors, journalists, and the board members I had known for decades, erupted into a chaotic symphony of outrage. I pushed the doors open. The heavy wood swung back with a thud that cut through the noise like a gunshot. The scene inside was a masterpiece of karmic timing. Vivian was standing at the head of the table, her face a ghastly translucent white, her eyes fixed on the massive wall-mounted screen that was still looping the footage of her stirring the arsenic into my cup. Her brother Mick was already halfway to the side exit, his face drenched in a panicked sweat. Her father sat frozen, his hand still clutching a champagne flute that was now shaking so violently the liquid was slopping over the rim. "The coffee was a bit bitter that morning, Vivienne," I said, my voice projected through the room's high-fidelity speaker system. I walked toward the table, the rhythmic tap of my cane on the marble, the floor marking the seconds of their downfall. "But I suppose that's the price of a perfect marriage." The room went deathly silent. Every camera, every phone, and every pair of eyes turned toward me. To them, I was a ghost that had just walked out of a grave. To Vivienne, I was the one variable she couldn't account for. "Xavier," she whispered, her voice cracking, her hands gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles were bone white. You're in a coma. The doctor said the brain damage was irreversible." "The doctors you paid, Vivian," I said, stopping at the foot of the table. "Fortunately, they were as incompetent as the brother you appointed as my COO. You thought 3 months was enough time to bury me. You didn't realize that in 3 months I wasn't just recovering, I was auditing." I looked at the board members, many of whom were staring at the floor in shame. "You stood by and watched this woman strip the marrow from this company. You watched her fire the people who built these walls and replace them with a family of vultures. Did you really think I wouldn't come back for what's mine?" "Xavier, honey, it's a misunderstanding," Mick shouted, finally finding his voice as he tried to edge back toward the table, hoping for a plea deal. "We were just protecting the assets. Vivian was under so much stress, she didn't know what she was doing." "Sit down, Mick," I commanded, and for the first time in 90 days, the authority of the Sterling name returned to that room. He collapsed into his chair as if the air had been kicked out of him. I pulled a leather folder from my coat and laid it on the table. "I've spent the last week with Gideon and a team of forensic accountants. We didn't just find the poison in the kitchen, we found it in the books. Vivienne, you've transferred $42 million into offshore accounts in the last 60 days alone. Mick, you've authorized consulting fees to 3 shell companies owned by your father that amount to another $12 million. And Patricia," I said, looking at Vivian's cousin who had been appointed head of HR, "you've been using the corporate pension fund as your personal travel budget." "This is a lie!" Vivian screamed, her desperation finally curdling into a shrill, ugly rage. "You're a sick man, Xavier. You're hallucinating. Security, get him out of here." 2 of the guards she hired stepped forward, but they stopped when the double doors at the back of the room burst open again. It wasn't more of Vivian's thugs. It was Gideon, followed by 12 uniformed officers from the Financial Crimes Division. "The security team has been neutralized, Mr. Sterling," Gideon said, his eyes fixed on Vivian with a grim satisfaction. "The police have the warrants for the house, the offshore logs, and the medical records from the clinic." I looked at my wife, the woman I had loved, the woman I had shared every secret with. "I'm not just firing you, Vivian. I'm erasing you. Every contract you signed is null. Every relative you put on the payroll is being escorted out by security as we speak. And as for your family," I turned to the lead officer, "I'd like to press full charges. Attempted murder, corporate fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. I want them all in handcuffs before the press leaves the room." The flashes of the cameras were blinding as the police moved in. Mick was the first to cry, begging for mercy as they clicked the cuffs onto his wrists. Vivian's father tried to claim he had chest pains, but the officers didn't buy it. When they reached Vivian, she didn't fight. She looked at me with a hatred so pure it was almost beautiful. "You think you've won, Xavier?" she hissed as they led her past me. "You're still a man with a broken heart and a poisoned body. You're alone." "I was alone in that hospital bed, Vivian," I said quietly. "Now I'm just independent. There's a difference." As they were let out, the room began to breathe again. I turned to the board members, who were waiting for their own execution. "As for the rest of you, you have 1 hour to clear your desks. You didn't stop her, you didn't question the coma. You were happy to let the company burn as long as the dividends kept coming. Consider yourselves fired for cause." I sat at the head of the table, the chair Vivian had tried to claim. My body was tired, and the metallic taste of the copper was still a ghost on my tongue, but the air in the room felt clean for the first time in months. I looked at the cameras that were still live streaming the event to millions of viewers. "My name is Xavier Sterling," I said, looking directly into the lens, "and the Sterling Global Recovery starts now. We're not just rebuilding a company, we're rebuilding a standard." Cassie, the nurse who had saved my life, was standing in the doorway. I gave her a small, solemn nod. I had a lot of lost time to make up for and a lot of damage to repair. But as I watched Vivian's white suit disappear into the back of a police cruiser on the monitors, I realized that the poison hadn't killed me. It had only made me immune to the lies. The following 48 hours were a surgical extraction of every rot-infested cell within Sterling Global. While the public was still reeling from the viral video of the arsenic heiress, I was back in the war room of my penthouse, a space Vivian had tried to turn into a yoga studio. I had a team of forensic auditors, 2 private investigators, and Gideon. My body was still recovering, my hands shook if I held a pen for too long, but my mind was sharper than the shards of the glass Vivian had dropped. We weren't just looking at the millions she had stolen, we were looking at the lives she had dismantled to get to them. "She fired 84 people while you were under," Gideon said, dropping a thick stack of personnel files onto my desk. "Not just anyone. She targeted the ones who knew the company's history. She targeted the whistleblowers and the loyalists. She replaced the entire safety inspection team with Mick's old fraternity brothers. They've been signing off on faulty solar grid installations for 3 months. It's a miracle the city hasn't caught fire yet." I felt the familiar metallic taste of rage in my mouth. "She didn't just want the money, Gideon. She wanted to burn the bridge behind her so I could never cross it again. She wanted the firm to be so corrupt that even if I did wake up, I'd be the one facing the lawsuits." I picked up the top file. A man named Ben, who had been my shop foreman for 12 years. Vivian had fired him for insubordination after he refused to sign off on a shipment of subpar lithium cells. "I want every single one of these 84 people called. Personally, tell them their positions are reinstated with a 20% hardship bonus. And tell Ben I need him in my office by 6 a.m. tomorrow. We have a lot of grid repairs to authorize." "Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments because we are about to witness the moment a man stops being a victim and starts being a hurricane." As the sun set over the Chicago skyline, I received a call from the precinct. Vivian was demanding a private meeting. She was refusing to talk to the feds until she spoke to me. Her lawyer, a shark named Vane, was claiming she had vital information about a secondary plot against the firm, information she would only trade for a reduced charge. I went. Not because I believed her, but because I needed to see the light die in her eyes one last time. The visitation room was cold and smelled of industrial bleach. Vivian sat behind the glass, her white suit now replaced by a coarse orange jumpsuit. The contrast was startling, but the arrogance in her expression was still there. She looked at me not with remorse, but with a predatory curiosity. "You look thin, Xavier," she said, her voice filtered through the grainy intercom. "The poison really did a number on your muscle mass. You should thank me. I gave you the first real rest you've had in a decade." "Is that what you call it, Vivian? A rest?" "I call it a 3-month audit of your character, and the results are in. You're bankrupt." "I have the offshore keys, Xavier," she hissed, leaning closer to the glass. "You found the 42 million, but you didn't find the rest. There's another 100 million buried in a trust in Singapore. I'll give you the codes. I'll give you the names of the board members who are on my payroll, and I'll walk away quietly. You get your company back, and I get a life in Europe. It's a fair trade." I leaned back, a cold smile touching my lips. "You think I want the money, Vivian? I'm the one who made the money. I can make it again. What I wanted was to see if you actually loved me or if you were just a very talented actress. You gave me the answer in that breakfast nook." I pulled a folded piece of paper from my pocket and pressed it against the glass. It was a letter from the Singaporean authorities. "Gideon didn't just track your local transfers. He's been working with Interpol since the day I woke up. Those accounts were frozen 4 hours ago. You aren't trading anything, Vivian. You're just confessing." The mask finally slipped, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. She slammed her fist against the glass, a sound that echoed like a gunshot in the small room. "You were always too smart for your own good. You were obsessed with that company. You treated me like an ornament, a trophy to be displayed at dinners while you talked about the future of energy. I was the one who made you look human, Xavier. Without me, you're just a machine. A machine that's still running," I said quietly, "while your family is currently being processed in the room next door." Mick is already talking, by the way. He's telling the police that the poisoning was entirely your idea. He's trading you for a chance to avoid a life sentence. She went silent then. The realization that even her own blood was scavenging her corpse seemed to hit her harder than the handcuffs. She sat back, her eyes hollow, the arsenic heiress, finally realizing that she was the only one left in the cage. I walked out of the prison and into the cool night air. The city was a grid of lights, a testament to the power I had built. But as I stood by my car, I didn't think about the stock price or the merger. I thought about the 84 people I was bringing back home. I thought about Ben and Cassie and the thousands of workers who didn't stir poison into their morning coffee. The next morning I arrived at Sterling Global at 5:45 a.m. The lobby was empty. The New Era banners Vivian had hung were already being torn down by the janitorial crew. I saw the head of the cleaning team, a man who had been with me for a decade. He looked at me, paused, and gave me a sharp, respectful nod. "Welcome back, Mr. Sterling," he said. "The floors are a bit dusty. The new management didn't care much for the details." "The details are everything, Frank," I said, handing him a business card. "I want the entire executive floor scrubbed. Use the strongest disinfectant you have. I want every trace of Vivian's family gone by noon." I took the elevator to the top floor. My office door was still open. I walked in and saw Mick's leather jacket draped over my chair. I didn't touch it. I picked up the phone and called security. "There's a piece of trash in my office. Have it incinerated." I sat at my desk and opened the master terminal. The board was meeting in 3 hours. They expected a man who was broken, a man who would beg them for stability. They were about to find out that a man who has survived a poisoning doesn't beg. He dictates. I hit the send button on a company-wide email. It was simple. "The vultures have been removed. The original team is returning. If you stayed and helped Vivian strip this company, your turn." But his eyes were the eyes of a cornered rat. "Xavier, my boy," he started, his voice a practiced baritone. "There's been a terrible misunderstanding. Vivian is a troubled girl. She has always been impulsive. I was only trying to manage the chaos she created." "Don't," I said, the word cutting through his lies like a blade. "I've seen the ledger, Arthur. I've seen the payments from the syndicate. I know you sold Vivian to me the same way you sold those faulty lithium cells to the Russians. You didn't manage chaos, you manufactured it." I leaned forward, the shadows of the room making my gaunt face look like a death mask. "Here is the deal. You're 68 years old. You won't survive 5 years in a state facility, let alone the 20 the feds are asking for. You give me the location of the secondary accounts, the ones Vivian doesn't even know about, and you testify that the marriage was a criminal conspiracy. You do that, and I'll make sure you end up in a minimum security medical wing. You don't, and I'll make sure you spend your final days in a cell with the very people you cheated." Arthur looked at me, and for the first time the mask fell away. He didn't look like a gentleman, he looked like a scavenger. "She was always the smart one," he whispered. "She told me you were too blinded by love to ever see the math. She was wrong. You're all math, aren't you, Xavier?" "I am now," I said. I walked out of the room with the codes to another $30 million. But it didn't feel like a win. It felt like a grim accounting of a life that had been built on a foundation of sand. By Friday, the Sterling purge was complete. Every member of Vivian's family was behind bars. The board members who had enabled her were being sued into oblivion. The company was dark, silent, and finally clean. I stood on the balcony of my office, watching the city below. The stock price was in the gutter, but the heart of the firm was finally mine again. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Cassie, the nurse. "The pediatric wing had its first patient today. A little girl with a heart condition. She's going to be okay." I looked at the message for a long time. Vivian had tried to take my life, my name, and my legacy. She thought that by poisoning my body, she could poison my future. She forgot that a man who has looked into the abyss and survived doesn't care about the dark. He only cares about the light he can build. I walked back into my office and picked up the phone. "Ben, turn the lights back on. We've got a world to power." The Sterling heart wasn't just beating, it was roaring. And as for Vivian, she was discovering that in the end, the most dangerous poison isn't arsenic, it's the truth. The following weeks at Sterling Global were a masterclass in controlled demolition. While the public saw a firm in recovery, I saw a structure that needed to be gutted before it could be reinforced. Vivian had been more than just a thief. She had been a psychological saboteur, infecting the very culture of my company with a sense of unearned arrogance and fear. I spent my days in the war room, a small, windowless space in the sub-basement where the real engineering happened. I didn't want the penthouse view anymore. I wanted to be near the foundations. By the end of the month, the financial wreckage Vivian and her family left behind was fully mapped. Mick had been more than just an incompetent COO. He had been a systematic looter. He had authorized maintenance contracts for our solar arrays that were actually payments to a shell company in Nevada. The arrays hadn't been serviced in months. We were sitting on a ticking time bomb of hardware failure. I sat across from my new CFO, Thalia, who had replaced the man Vivian had bought with a vacation home in the Keys. "The grid is failing, Xavier," Thalia said, her voice flat. "If we don't spend $20 million on immediate repairs, the Sterling name will be synonymous with the biggest blackout in the city's history." Vivian didn't just spend the money, she gambled on the assumption that you wouldn't be around to answer for the fallout. "She was betting on a funeral, Thalia," I said, rubbing my temples. "She wanted the company to be a hollowed-out shell so that when it finally collapsed, the blame would fall on my failing health and poor management during my final months. She wasn't just a murderer, she was a frame artist. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments because we are about to see what happens when a man stops being the architect of his fortune and starts being the architect of his survival. While I was fighting to keep the power on, Vivian's legal team was attempting a different kind of attack. From her jail cell, she had filed a civil suit claiming that the prenuptial agreement was signed under duress and that she was entitled to half of my personal estate, even as she stood accused of trying to kill me. It was a move born of pure unadulterated hubris. She believed that the legal system was just another game she could win with a good enough performance. I met her lawyer, a shark named Vanderbilt, in a neutral conference room. He was the kind of man who wore a $3,000 suit to a deposition and spoke in measured, oily tones. "Mr. Sterling, my client is prepared to drop the civil suit and provide the location of the remaining liquidated assets in exchange for a recommendation of leniency in her criminal trial. She's a woman who is overwhelmed by the pressure of your expectations. She made mistakes, but she doesn't deserve to die in a cage." I looked at him, and for the first time since I woke up, I felt a cold, sharp sense of humor. "You're a talented man, Vanderbilt. To frame a systematic poisoning as stress is almost impressive, but you're forgetting one thing. I don't need her recommendation, I don't need her keys, and I certainly don't care about her desire to avoid a cage." I leaned forward, the shadows of the room highlighting the gauntness of my face. "I have the security footage from the breakfast nook, I have the bank logs, and I have her brother Mick, who is currently crying in a separate room, telling the feds exactly how Vivian coached him on how to forge my signature. There is no deal. There is no leniency. There is only the absolute destruction of every person who walked into my house and thought they could treat my life like a bargain bin." Vanderbilt's smile faltered. He saw the fire in my eyes, the fire of a man who had already been through the furnace. He packed his briefcase in silence. He knew that the arsenic heiress was finally out of moves. The breakthrough for the firm came a week later. Ben, the foreman I had reinstated, found the original blueprints for the deep core projects that Mick had tried to hide. It turned out that the stolen specs were actually decoys I had created years ago in case of industrial espionage. The real data was hidden in a secondary server I had buried under the foundation of my own house. Vivian had been selling garbage to the highest bidder, and now those bidders were coming for her. "They're not happy, Xavier," Gideon said, entering my office with a grin. "The syndicate in Dubai and the rival firms in Europe just realized the data they bought from Vivian is worthless. They're already filing their own private lawsuits against her family's offshore holdings. We don't even have to sue them. The people they cheated will take care of the rest." I sat at my desk and opened the blinds. The city was glowing, a sea of lights powered by the very grid I had fought to save. The Sterling heart was beating stronger than it had been in years. The poison had been a catalyst. It had stripped away the vanity and the false trust, leaving behind a man who knew exactly what his life was worth. I looked at the portrait of my father on the wall. He had always told me that a man is on lie as good as the structure he builds. Vivian had tried to demolish mine, but she forgot that a building with a deep enough foundation can withstand any storm. My wife had told everyone I was dead to take my firm. She had recovered the status, but she had lost the ground beneath her feet. I had recovered my firm and I had found my life. I stood at the window, the sun dipping below the horizon. The cleanup was finished, the structure was sound. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't just building for the future, I was living in it. The following weeks were a masterclass in psychological warfare. Vivian had spent years studying me, but she had studied the man who was blinded by love, not the man who had been tempered by the metallic taste of death. By early November, the legal dust began to settle into a pattern of absolute ruin for her family. My lawyers had successfully argued to annul the marriage on the grounds of criminal conspiracy, effectively turning Vivian into a legal stranger to my estate. She wasn't just losing the firm, she was losing every penny she had ever touched while wearing my ring. I spent my nights in the library, the quietest room in the mansion, surrounded by the only things that hadn't betrayed me, my books and my father's old ledgers. But the silence was often interrupted by the ghosts of the life I had lost. I would find myself staring at the empty space on the wall where a portrait of us used to hang, or flinching when a floorboard creaked in the hallway. I realized that while I had won the corporate war, the internal reconstruction was going to take much longer. Vivian hadn't just poisoned my body, she had poisoned the very concept of home. "You need to sleep, Xavier," Gideon said, stepping into the room one night with a glass of water, filtered, sealed, and poured in front of me. He had become my shadow, the only person I trusted to be in my personal space. "The board meeting is at 8 a.m. You can't lead a revolution on 4 hours of restless thinking." "I'm not thinking, Gideon. I'm calculating," I replied, my eyes fixed on a small hand-carved box on the shelf. It was the first gift I ever gave Vivian, a simple wooden trinket from a market in Florence. I picked it up and felt the weight of it. She kept this on her nightstand for 5 years. Even while she was stirring the arsenic, she kept this. How does a person do that? How do they hold a memory in one hand and a weapon in the other? "Some people don't see memory, Xavier, they see leverage," Gideon said quietly. "To her, that box wasn't a gift, it was part of the costume. It made you believe she was sentimental." I gripped the box until the wood groaned, then I dropped it into the fireplace. I watched the flames lick at the cedar until it turned to ash. "Burn it all, Gideon, every photo, every gift, every scrap of paper that has her handwriting on it. I want this house to be as empty as she is." Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments because we're about to see the moment a man stops looking for answers and starts looking for the horizon. The next morning, the board meeting was a far cry from the chaotic resurrection of a few weeks prior. This was a meeting of accountability. I sat at the head of the table looking at the 6 remaining members who hadn't been fired or indicted. They were the ones who had been too cowardly to join Vivian but too weak to stop her. They sat with their pens ready, their eyes averted, waiting for the storm to pass. "The Sterling Vance merger is officially dead," I announced, my voice echoing in the silent room. "The rival firm that tried to buy us is currently under investigation for collusion with Mick. We've reclaimed the deep core thermal patents and we're moving the manufacturing back to the Chicago plants." "And the capital?" one member asked, a man named Sterling Sr., my uncle who had remained silent during my coma. "We lost a fortune in stock dip, Xavier. The banks are nervous." "The capital is coming from the clawback of Vivian's personal assets," I said, leaning forward, "and from my own personal divestment from our luxury real estate holdings. We're selling the penthouse, the Aspen Lodge, and the villa in Saint-Tropez. We don't need monuments to a life that was a lie. We need to pay our workers and fix our grid." The board nodded in unison. They weren't nodding out of agreement. They were nodding out of fear. They saw the man I had become, a man. RTS, building a future that no one can poison. By mid-December, the legal system had finally delivered its final judgment. Vivian's trial had been a formality. With the security footage, the bank logs, and her brother Mick's devastating testimony, there was no room for her stress-induced impulsive behavior defense. She was sentenced to 30 years in a high-security facility. Her father Arthur received 15. Mick, the crying brother, got 10. The entire parasitic family had been dismantled, their assets seized, and their names turned into a cautionary tale for the city's elite. I went to the sentencing, not to speak, but to watch. I sat in the back row of the courtroom, wearing a simple dark suit. When the judge read the verdict, Vivian didn't look at the judge, she looked at me. For a split second I saw a flicker of the old Vivian, the one who could make me believe I was the only man in the world. Then the mask cracked. She realized I wasn't there to gloat. I was there to be the last person she ever saw as a free woman. I wanted her to carry the image of my health, my strength, and my absolute indifference into that cell with her. As she was led out in handcuffs, the heavy doors of the courtroom swinging shut behind her, I felt a strange, hollow sensation. It wasn't joy. It wasn't even relief. It was the feeling of a debt being settled. The Sterling versus Vance war was over. I walked out of the courthouse and into the crisp winter air, Snow was beginning to fall, a white blanket over the gray city. I returned to the mansion that evening. Gideon had finished the purge of the personal items. The house was empty, the rooms echoing with a silence that was finally peaceful rather than predatory. I walked into the kitchen, the place where the poison had been brewed, and looked at the breakfast nook. The table had been replaced, the rug was gone, even the light fixture had been changed. I sat down and poured myself a cup of tea. I made it myself. I knew exactly where the leaves had come from, exactly who had handled the water, and exactly what was in the cup. I took a sip. It was warm, clean, and perfectly clear. My phone buzzed on the table. It was a message from Gideon. The SEC has officially cleared the new board. The stock price has stabilized. We're opening the new grid in February. You did it, Xavier. I looked at the message, then out the window at the city. The lights of the Sterling grid were twinkling against the snow, a sea of artificial stars that I had fought to keep burning. My wife had told everyone I was dead to take my firm. She had recovered the gold, but she had lost the soul. I had recovered my life, and I had found my way back to the start. I stood up and walked to the study. I picked up a pen and started a list. Not a list of people to fire or a list of assets to seize. It was a list of names for the new scholarship fund I was creating, a fund for the children of the foundry workers. I decided to name it the Cassie Protocol, in honor of the nurse who saw a man when the world saw a vegetable. The copper taste was gone. The shadows were receding, and as the snow fell silently over Chicago, the man who had been poisoned was finally truly awake. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and share your own stories of survival in the comments. Your voice matters, and the truth is the only thing they can never truly bury. The weeks following the sentencing felt like a slow thaw after a decade-long winter. While the public had moved on to the next corporate scandal, I was engaged in a much quieter, more profound battle, the war against the habit of suspicion. I spent my days at the firm, but my nights were spent in a small house I had bought on the outskirts of the city, a place Vivian had never touched. The mansion was being converted into a residential treatment center for victims of domestic and corporate abuse, a final poetic use for the rooms where she had plotted my demise. In January, the reconstruction reached its final phase. We were preparing for the launch of the Titan Grid, the renewable energy project Vivian had tried to sell to the highest bidder. It was more than a technical achievement, it was a symbol of the firm's restored integrity. I sat in my new office, located on a lower floor closer to the engineering teams, reviewing the final safety protocols with Ben. The metallic taste of the past was finally fading, replaced by the scent of fresh blueprints and the hum of real work. The team is ready, Xavier, Ben said, leaning over my desk. The grid goes live at midnight. The city will be powered by the very patents they tried to steal. I think your father would have been proud of the way you held the line. I looked at a framed photo of my father on the wall, one of the few things I had rescued from the mansion before the renovation. My father always told me that the strength of a building isn't in its height, but in its foundation. Vivian thought she could build a throne on top of a grave. She forgot that a grave is just a hole in the ground until you fill it with a soul. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments, because we are about to see the moment a man stops being the ghost of his past and starts being the architect of a future that no one can poison. As the clock ticked toward midnight, I stood in the central control room of Sterling Global. The board members I had hand-picked, mostly former engineers and veteran managers who had stayed loyal during the dark months, were gathered around the monitors. There was no champagne, no press, and no gaudy speeches. Just a group of people waiting to see the light. At exactly 12:00 a.m., I hit the master switch. On the massive wall-mounted map of the city, the red dots of the old failing grid turned a vibrant, steady green. One by one, the sectors of Chicago lit up, powered by the deep-core thermal energy we had fought to protect. It was a silent victory, but it was the loudest moment of my life. Grid is stable, the lead engineer announced, her voice trembling slightly. Load is holding at 98%. We did it, Mr. Sterling. I walked out onto the balcony overlooking the city. Below me, the streets were alive with light. The schools, the hospitals, the homes, they were all humming with an energy that was finally honest. I realized then that my death hadn't just been a betrayal, it had been a filter. It had removed the vanity, the false love, and the greedy sycophants from my life, leaving behind the only thing that actually mattered, the capacity to serve. I received a final message from Gideon that night. He had been monitoring the prison logs. Vivian's father has been moved to the medical wing. He's not talking anymore. Mick is in general population. He's learning that a coup title doesn't mean much in the yard. And Vivian, she spent the last 48 hours in solitary for trying to bribe a guard with a wedding ring she'd hidden in her mattress. I looked at the city lights and didn't feel the urge to reply. The Sterling versus Vance war was no longer a part of my internal dialogue. I had paid the debt of my own blindness, and I had collected the interest on my survival. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went to a local diner for breakfast. I sat at a booth, ordered a black coffee, and watched the world go by. The waitress, a woman with tired eyes and a kind smile, set the mug down in front of me. "Careful, it's hot," she said. I took a sip. It wasn't bitter. It didn't taste like copper. It tasted like coffee. It tasted like a Tuesday morning. It tasted like a second chance. I sat there for an hour, just a man in a booth, watching the people of the city head toward the jobs my firm had saved. I wasn't the lion anymore. I wasn't the ghost. I was just Xavier, and for the first time in my life, that was more than enough, my wife had told everyone I was dead to take my firm. She had recovered the status, but she had lost the ground beneath her feet. I had recovered my life, and I had found my way back to the light. The resurrection was over, the cleanup was done, and as the sun rose over the lake, I realized that the best revenge wasn't the fire, it was the warmth that remained when the fire was finally under control. The transition from the resurrection to the new era was not a fast process, but a deliberate one. By early March, the Sterling Global headquarters no longer felt like a crime scene, it felt like a workshop. I had officially moved my office to the 4th floor, right in the heart of the engineering and logistics department. The executive floor remained empty, a silent memorial to the vanity that almost destroyed us. Every time I looked at the city's skyline, I didn't see a map of my wealth, I saw a grid of responsibility. While the arsenic heiress was a fading memory for the public, the legal cleanup reached its final, most satisfying conclusion. My legal team had successfully petitioned to have every single patent sale authorized by Vivian during my coma declared fraudulent. The foreign competitors who had bought my life's work were forced to return the data or face international sanctions. We didn't just get our secrets back, we got a massive settlement from the firms that had tried to scavenge my corpse. I used every penny of that settlement to fund the Sterling Cassie Center, a facility dedicated to training nurses to spot the signs of domestic poisoning and medical gaslighting. I spent my afternoons in the center's library watching the students study. They were the real heirs to my fortune, not the woman who shared my bed while stirring a sedative, but the people who would ensure no one else would ever be as alone as I was in room 412. I realized then that my poisoning wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a systemic failure. I had built a life so high and so insulated that the people who loved me couldn't reach me, but the people who wanted to kill me had the keys to the front door. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments because we are about to see the moment a man stops being a story and starts being a standard. In April, Gideon came to me with a final piece of information. He had found a hidden safe in our old Aspen Lodge, a place Vivian's family had missed during the initial liquidation. Inside wasn't money or jewelry, it was a collection of journals Vivian had kept during our first 3 years of marriage. I sat by the fire and read them, expecting to find more evidence of her cold-blooded calculations. Instead, I found a tragedy. She had started out truly admiring me. She wrote about my drive, my vision, and my kindness. But slowly the entries changed. They were poisoned by her father, Arthur, who kept reminding her that a Vance doesn't serve, they rule. She'd been groomed to destroy the very thing she loved. By the end, the journals were filled with a desperate, fractured logic. She convinced herself that by taking the burden of the company from me, she was actually saving me. The arsenic wasn't just greed in her mind, it was an exit strategy for a life she felt she could no longer control. I dropped the journals into the fire. I didn't feel pity for her, but I finally felt a sense of closure. She wasn't a monster born of the dark, she was a person who had chosen the dark over the light. And in the end, that choice had cost her everything. By the time the spring thaw reached Chicago, the Titan grid was operating at full capacity. We hadn't just saved the city's power, we had lowered the rates for the working class by 30%. I was no longer the man whose face was on the cover of Forbes for his net worth. I was the man whose name was on the utility bills for his integrity. My siblings-in-law and my father-in-law were still in their cells, their appeals denied, their name a footnote in a criminal textbook. Vivian remained in solitary, her only company the silence she had tried to impose on me. I stood on the balcony of my small house one evening, watching the first flowers bloom in the garden. I was thinner than I used to be. My hair was a bit grayer, and I still had a slight tremor in my left hand. But for the first time in my life, I felt whole. I wasn't waiting for the next merger or the next stock jump. I was waiting for the morning. My wife had told everyone I was dead to take my firm. She had recovered the status, but she had lost the soul. I had recovered my life, and I had found my peace. The copper taste was a ghost, the shadows were gone, and the sterling heart was finally beating for the right reasons. I picked up the phone and called Gideon. "The cleanup is finished, Gideon. Close the books, we're not looking back anymore." I hung up and looked at the moon. The resurrection was complete, the cleanup was done, and as the city breathed below me a sea of honest lights, I realized that the best revenge wasn't the fire, it was the warmth that remained when the fire was finally out. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and share your own stories of survival in the comments. Your voice matters, and the truth is the only thing they can never truly bear. The transition into the summer months brought a stillness that I had once feared but now craved. The frantic energy of the Vance purge had settled into a steady industrial rhythm. Sterling Global was no longer a news story, it was a success story. But as the external world quieted, my internal landscape remained a territory under construction. I had spent so much of my life as a predator in the boardroom that learning how to be a person again was the most difficult project I had ever managed. I had to learn how to trust a cup of water, how to sleep without a security guard at my door, and how to look at a woman without wondering if she was measuring the dosage of my demise. I spent June traveling to the regional offices not to give speeches but to listen. I sat in the break rooms with the line workers in Ohio and the engineers in Arizona. I wanted to see the faces of the people Vivian had deemed expendable assets. What I found was a deep, resonant pride in the Sterling name that had survived even her worst efforts. They didn't care about the scandal. E-board members, now a group of seasoned veterans and former union leaders, didn't applaud for the profits. They applauded for the stability. "The company is sound, Xavier," my new COO Ben said as we walked out into the cool evening air. "The grid is stable, the reputation is restored, and the family name, it means something good again. What are you going to do now? You've been working 20 hours a day since you woke up." I looked at the horizon, the sun dipping below the line of the buildings I had built. "I'm going to take a breath, Ben. I'm going to go to that diner, have a coffee I didn't make myself, and I'm going to watch the sun come up without checking a stock ticker." I spent the next week in a cabin on the lake, far from the reach of a cell signal. I sat on the porch and watched the water, the silence finally becoming a friend rather than an enemy. I thought about the man who had collapsed in the breakfast nook, and the man I was now. We were the same person, but the version of me that came back was better. He was harder, yes, but he was also more honest. He had been through the fire and found that the only things that don't burn are the things you can't buy. My wife had told everyone I was dead to take my firm. She had recovered the status, but she had lost the ground beneath her feet. I had recovered my life, and I had found my peace. The copper taste was a memory, the shadows were gone, and the sterling heart was finally beating for the right reasons. I stood at the edge of the lake and threw a stone into the water, watching the ripples spread until they touched the shore. The resurrection was over. The cleanup was done, and as the moon rose over the water, a silver light on a dark world, I realized that the best revenge wasn't the arrest, it was the quiet, steady life that continued long after the vultures had starved. Thanks for listening to my story. I know there are a lot of people out there dealing with their own betrayals, their own poisons in their lives. Just remember, the truth is a slow-acting antidote, but it's the only one that actually works. Don't be afraid to clear the room. Don't be afraid to start over. And most importantly, don't be afraid to wake up. Your life belongs to you, and no one, not even the people you love most, can take it unless you let them. My name is Xavier Sterling, and I'm still here. The final 858 words of my journey didn't feel like a victory lap. They felt like the steady, grounding thrum of a machine that was finally, after years of friction, running perfectly. I sat in the sun-drenched library of my new home, a modest estate far from the glass towers and the echoing hallways of my old life. The air here was different. It didn't smell of floor wax and corporate secrets. It smelled of the lake and the coming autumn. My name is Xavier Sterling, and I am a man who has finally learned that the most important construction project of a lifetime is the one that happens inside your own ribcage. The arsenic scandals had finally been relegated to the archives of legal history. Vivian's final appeal was denied in late September, a short 3-page ruling that cited the overwhelming and undisputed evidence of premeditated criminal intent. I didn't even read the full document. Gideon told me the result over a quiet dinner, and I simply nodded and moved on to discussing the expansion of our solar project in the Midwest. The woman who had tried to turn me into a ghost was now a ghost herself, a number in a system that didn't care about her designer suits or her father's consulting fees. She was no longer a threat, she was a lesson I had finally finished learning. I spent my final days of the reconstruction focusing on the Sterling Foundation. We had moved beyond just medical advocacy. We were now funding the legal defense of whistleblowers in the energy sector, people who were currently where I used to be, staring down a corporate giant with nothing but the truth in their pockets. I met with the first group of recipients in October. They were young, nervous, and full of the same idealistic fire I had possessed before the world taught me how to grow claws. "Don't look for a throne," I told them, as we sat in the Foundation's new auditorium. "A throne is just a seat with a target on the back. Look for the foundation. Look for the people who tell you the truth when it's inconvenient. Because in the end, the only thing that will keep you upright when the poison hits is the strength of the people you didn't fire. I felt a profound sense of closure that afternoon. The money that Vivian had tried to launder through the cartel was now paying for the tuition of nurses and the legal fees of honest men. The Vane name was being erased from the ledgers, replaced by a legacy of accountability. My father's old firm was no longer a family business in the biological sense, it was a family business in the moral sense. We were bound not by blood, but by a shared belief that the lights should stay on for everyone. As the first snow of the season began to fall over the lake, I stood on the porch of my house. I was thinner than I had been, and my hand still carried a slight permanent tremor, a souvenir from the copper taste. But I felt more powerful than I ever had at the head of $1 billion boardroom. I had survived the betrayal of the person I trusted most. I had reclaimed my life from a grave she had dug with my own money. And I had discovered that the best revenge wasn't the sound of the handcuffs clicking shut, it was the sound of my own breath in a quiet room. I received one final package in December. It was from Cassie, the nurse. She had sent me a photo of the first graduating class from the Sterling Cassie Medical Center. 40 women and men standing in their white coats, ready to go into the dark rooms of the world and look for the people who are being silenced. I looked at their faces and realized that this was the real Titan grid. This was the energy that would actually change the world. I sat in my library, the fireplace crackling, and opened a book I hadn't touched since before the poisoning. It was a collection of poems my mother used to read. I turned to a page I had bookmarked years ago, and for the first time in 10,000 words, I didn't think about the math. I didn't think about the audit. I didn't think about the poison. I just read, my wife had told everyone I was dead to take my firm. She had recovered the status, but she had lost the light. I had recovered my life, and I had found my soul. The copper taste was gone. The shadows were still there, but they were just part of the landscape now, reminders of where I had been and how far I had traveled. I stood up and walked to the window. The city was glowing on the horizon, a sea of honest lights powered by the grid I had fought to save. I was still Xavier Sterling, but I was finally a version of him that I actually liked. I turned off the lamp and let the moon be my only guide. The resurrection was over, the cleanup was done, and as the night air filled the room cold and crisp and real, I realized that I wasn't just a man who had survived. I was a man who had finally begun to live